It all began during a tense congressional hearing that had already drawn national attention. The room was packed, members of the media, political aides, and spectators sat shoulder to shoulder. Representative Jasmine Crockett, known for her sharp legal mind and unwavering composure, took her seat at the head of the panel. Attorney General Merrick Garland, composed but visibly defensive, was there to answer questions regarding recent actions taken by the Department of Justice. While many representatives approached him cautiously, Crockett came prepared with facts, precedent, and a tone that cut straight through the noise. After several routine exchanges, Garland suddenly shifted. "Representative Crockett," he said, narrowing his gaze, "if you understood the full context of constitutional law, you might not be so quick to misrepresent my office's actions." A murmur swept the room. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Garland's words were meant to diminish her. A calculated move. A power play. But Crockett didn't flinch. She leaned forward slightly, a small smile curling at the edge of her lips. "Mr. Garland," she said smoothly, "you're speaking to someone who practiced constitutional law long before I walked these halls. So if we're going to play that game, I suggest you bring more than just a title to the table." The room went completely still, the tension was electric. Even members from Garland's own party shifted in their seats, unsure whether to intervene or let the moment play out. Garland adjusted his glasses, clearly not expecting that level of pushback, especially not delivered so calmly. Jasmine Crockett wasn't raising her voice. She didn't need to. Her confidence did all the talking. A conservative representative 2 seats down tried to chuckle, perhaps to break the silence. But Crockett turned slightly in his direction and said without missing a beat, "Is there something amusing about a woman defending her credentials, or are you just not used to being challenged with facts?" Silence again. Cameras were rolling. Clips were already being cut in real time for social media. Garland cleared his throat. "I didn't mean to imply," but Crockett raised a hand gently, stopping him. "Intent is often less important than impact, General. And the impact of dismissing my legal background in front of this body, and the American people, will not go unnoticed." She reached down, pulled out a binder, and opened it flat on the table. "Let's get back to the facts. Because I didn't come here for theatrics. I came here to hold this institution accountable." Gasps. Then applause, faint at first, but real. Even a few opponents looked genuinely impressed. Garland leaned forward, attempting to recover his footing. "Representative Crockett," he began, "while I respect your passion, I think it's important we maintain the decorum of this chamber. I wasn't questioning your intelligence, I was challenging your interpretation." But Crockett didn't blink. "With all due respect," she said, her tone razor-sharp but measured, "decorum is not a shield for condescension. If we're going to talk about interpretation, then let's be precise, because vague language from the Department of Justice is exactly what's created confusion across the country." She flipped a page in her binder and slid a printed excerpt across the table. "This is from your own memo dated 3 weeks ago. You stated that certain investigations were paused for strategic reassessment. Now, would you kindly define what that means under DOJ policy?" Garland hesitated. "That depends on the case," Crockett leaned in. "Then let's pick one." The air grew heavier. "Would you like to discuss the handling of the whistleblower complaint from last month? Or should we move to the matter of federal oversight concerning civil liberties infringements in Louisiana?" Garland's mouth opened, but no words came. For a split second, he looked genuinely caught off guard. Crockett sat back in her chair, composed and commanding. "I'm not here to score points, Mr. Garland. I'm here because the people who sent me expect clarity, not clever dodges." A subtle ripple of agreement moved through the crowd. Even some of Garland's supporters couldn't deny, she had taken control of the room. Garland exhaled slowly, clearly weighing his next move. "Representative Crockett," he said, "I'm not here to play political games either. The DOJ acts in the best interest of justice, not headlines." Crockett raised an eyebrow. "Then maybe it's time your department stopped behaving like it's afraid of both." A collective, "Oh," whispered through the audience like a wave. She continued, flipping to another tab in her binder. "Because the last time I checked, justice doesn't delay action when civil rights are being trampled. Justice doesn't hide behind legalese when communities are crying out for transparency." Garland sat motionless, lips pressed into a thin line. Crockett turned toward the committee chair. "Madam Chair, I would like to formally request that Mr. Garland submit an amended statement clarifying the DOJ's position on investigative prioritization. Vague memos don't cut it anymore, not when lives are at stake." The chair, visibly taken aback, nodded. "The request is noted. General Garland, you will comply." The room erupted into murmurs. Staffers began typing furiously. Phones buzzed across the aisle. Journalists in the back were already live-tweeting the exchange. Garland, realizing the optics of the moment, simply nodded. "I will provide a detailed clarification." Crockett gave a single nod. "Good. Because accountability isn't optional, not for me, not for this body, and certainly not for you." Her voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. She had already shut the room down, not with anger, but with undeniable authority. As the session continued, the energy in the chamber had completely shifted. What started as a routine hearing had turned into a defining moment, one that no one could ignore. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just asking questions anymore. She was setting the tone. Even representatives who had come in skeptical were now listening more closely. Some leaned forward. Others whispered to aides, asking for copies of the memo she referenced. Garland, for his part, remained composed, but his body language had changed. His responses grew more careful, less deflective. It was clear he understood that Crockett wasn't someone who could be brushed aside. She took a sip of water and leaned back, allowing another member to take their turn. But her presence lingered like thunder in the distance. Reporters in the hallway were already calling it the moment Garland lost the room. One headline would later read, "Crockett turns the tables, DOJ scrambling for answers after congressional smackdown." But in that room, it wasn't about headlines. It was about power, and who was really in control. And on that day, Jasmine Crockett made sure everyone knew, she came prepared, she came principled, and she wasn't going to be silenced. As the hearing moved into its second hour, Garland regained some footing, delivering polished answers to less confrontational questions. But everyone in the room knew, the dynamic had changed. Then, Jasmine Crockett requested the floor once more. The room went quiet again. "I want to circle back," she said, her voice steady, "because while we've danced around semantics and intent, the American people don't get the luxury of legal vagueness. They live with consequences." She tapped her pen against the binder rhythmically. "I represent communities who've seen the worst of slow justice. And with respect, Mr. Garland, they're tired of waiting." Garland nodded slightly, his tone softer. "I understand the frustration," she cut in. "Frustration doesn't begin to cover it. You're the highest law enforcement officer in the nation. If policies from your office leave room for injustice, then we're not talking about frustration, we're talking about failure." Gasps echoed. This time, louder. But Crockett wasn't finished. "Look," she said, shifting her tone just slightly, more earnest, more personal, "I'm not trying to villainize you. But you need to understand, if we don't demand better from you, then we're complicit in the silence that's been killing accountability." The room was still. Even Garland didn't argue. And for the first time that day, he seemed not only to listen, but to hear her. Garland sat back, no longer interrupting, no longer trying to redirect. The words had landed, all of them. And the silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was powerful. Jasmine Crockett glanced briefly around the chamber. "You know," she said quietly, "people ask me why I go so hard in these hearings. Why I challenge, why I press. But the truth is, I don't have the luxury of being silent. Not when my constituents live with the consequences of every delay, every half-answer, every shrugged-off responsibility. She let the words hang for a moment, then looked directly at Garland. "You've been in law a long time, Mr. Garland. So you know, silence can be louder than words. And right now, silence from your office is echoing in communities that are barely holding on." The Attorney General nodded slowly. "You've made your point," he admitted. "Loud and clear." Crockett sat back and folded her hands. "Good. Then maybe today wasn't a loss after all." The chair recognized the next speaker, but no one was really listening anymore. Not yet. Because everyone, from the reporters to the representatives, was still caught in the gravity of what just happened. Garland had come into the room expecting to defend policy. He left the room knowing he'd been held accountable by a force he couldn't dismiss. Jasmine Crockett had not only shut down a condescending exchange, she had commanded the entire room. When the hearing adjourned, the tension didn't end, it spilled into the hallways, onto social media, and across every major news outlet within the hour. Clips of Crockett's exchange with Garland were already going viral. Hashtags like #CrockettClapback and #GarlandGrilled trended on X and TikTok. CNN aired the segment with the headline, "Representative Jasmine Crockett schools AG Garland in scathing exchange on DOJ accountability." Fox News tried a different angle, "Crockett grandstands, turns oversight into personal attack." But no matter the spin, no one could deny one fact: she had dominated the moment. Back in her office, Crockett sat reviewing her notes. A staffer knocked and entered with a tablet. "You're being requested on 4 different networks tonight," he said, clearly both impressed and overwhelmed. Jasmine didn't look up. "Not tonight. Let the clip speak." He nodded and left quietly. She exhaled deeply. Her calm had never broken, but she knew exactly what today meant. This wasn't just about one exchange. It was about shifting the balance, showing that oversight wasn't performative, and that respect wasn't something you begged for. It was something you commanded. And today, she didn't just win a moment. She set a new standard. The next morning, Crockett walked into the Capitol to more nods than usual, even from those who had once dismissed her as too direct or too emotional. A few Republicans offered polite, if reluctant, respect. A handful of moderates whispered, "You said what needed to be said." Even some of Garland's aides, though they wouldn't admit it on record, privately acknowledged she had exposed gaps the department could no longer ignore. But what struck her most were the messages pouring into her office from across the country. Emails from young law students, working mothers, community organizers, and even retired judges. One email read, "You didn't just speak truth to power, you reminded power why truth matters." Another said, "Thank you for showing what leadership looks like, even when the room doesn't want to hear it." She leaned back in her chair, letting it all sink in. The hearing wasn't just a political flashpoint. It had become something bigger, a viral symbol of what accountability looks like when delivered with knowledge, confidence, and dignity. Garland's office issued a follow-up statement that afternoon, vague, careful, and clearly influenced by the public reaction. It acknowledged concerns raised during the hearing and promised clarity and improvements in public communication. It wasn't everything. But it was a start. And Jasmine Crockett knew, it wouldn't be the last time she'd have to challenge someone in power. But next time, they'd know better than to underestimate her. Days after the hearing, the political world was still buzzing. Pundits debated whether Garland had truly stumbled or simply encountered someone who refused to play by the unspoken rules of Washington politeness. But no matter the interpretation, one thing was clear: Jasmine Crockett had reshaped the narrative. She didn't yell. She didn't insult. She used precision. She used law. She used power. And people noticed. Behind closed doors, some senior lawmakers began revisiting protocols around oversight hearings. New questions emerged, not just about the Department of Justice, but about how often officials had been allowed to slip through soft questioning and vague accountability. Crockett, meanwhile, returned to work as usual. She didn't gloat. She didn't do the talk show circuit. She stayed in her lane, writing policy, prepping for committee meetings, and showing up for her district. But her presence in future hearings? Stronger. Sharper. Respected. For many young women watching, especially women of color, she had become something bigger than a headline. She was proof that you didn't have to choose between professionalism and power. You could own both. And Garland? Though he remained in his post, the moment followed him. The next time he testified, his answers were clearer. Sharper. He knew the bar had been raised. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just shut down a room. She had raised the volume of truth, so loud, it echoed far beyond those four walls. Weeks later, the impact of that hearing was still surfacing, not just in D.C., but nationwide. Community leaders began citing Crockett's line of questioning in town halls. Legal forums dissected her approach as a masterclass in assertive yet respectful confrontation. Law schools invited her to speak. Civil rights groups replayed the clip as an example of how to demand answers without shouting, and still shake the system. Even in private circles of power, think tanks, old guard political strategists, senior consultants, there was an acknowledgement that something had shifted. Garland himself, though quiet about the exchange, began subtly adjusting the tone in future hearings. His team released more transparent updates. Less delay. Less jargon. He never said it publicly, but those close to him admitted, Crockett's presence recalibrated the threshold for what's acceptable in public accountability. And as for Crockett, she stayed focused. In an interview weeks later, when asked how it felt to go viral, she shrugged. Accountability isn't a moment, it's a mindset, she said. If you're showing up just to go viral, you're in the wrong building. The interviewer smiled. So what's next? Jasmine paused, then gave a small grin. I'm just getting started. Months passed, but the hearing remained a reference point in political circles, legal classrooms, and activist spaces. It wasn't just a viral clip anymore, it was being studied. Quoted. Imitated. Jasmine Crockett had unknowingly lit a fuse. Young representatives, both newcomers and seasoned ones, began adopting her tone, direct, prepared, unshaken. Her approach wasn't just admired, it was replicated. Journalists covering Capitol Hill started referring to moments as having been Crockett level, when an official was sharply held to account. Behind the scenes, new legislative proposals emerged, one centered on DOJ transparency, whistleblower protections, and clearer language in federal communications. Crockett co-sponsored several of them. Meanwhile, Garland quietly shifted his public posture. He offered clearer timelines in future statements and made it a point to consult with community representatives more directly. Whether he wanted to admit it or not, Crockett had reshaped how power interacted with truth. And in communities that had long felt invisible, where justice too often felt delayed or denied, something else was happening. People felt seen. One viral comment under the hearing's full video said it best, she didn't just speak for herself. She spoke for all of us who've been told to sit down, stay quiet, or wait our turn. Not anymore. Crockett didn't need to announce her legacy. She was already living it. And Washington? It was still catching up.